Next session is one that was actually one that I pitched to talk about design systems, but whether or not we really need them. And so, as somebody who actually makes a living working on design systems, maybe that's a risky thing to bring up. But I think that where we land on uppercase and lowercase ds for a design system can and should vary widely. So I wanted to talk to some folks that have way more experience with it than I do. So I looked around through some of the Slack and Discord channels that I'm a part of, and I found some folks that I think are going to be able to shed some really interesting light on this topic. I've got Kathleen McMahon. Kathleen is a wonderful human being. She's a software engineer, designer, conference speaker from the Boston area. Currently spending a lot of time as a senior design systems engineer at Northwestern Mutual when she is not traveling around the world talking about design systems and such. But she also spends a lot of time on the W3C Design Tokens community group, and that was actually one of the things that really caught my eye, because I've been spending a lot of time thinking and working with design tokens. And thankfully, Kathleen led me to our next panelist, Donna Vitan. Donna, I just been realizing that I didn't ask you how to pronounce your name, so I apologize if I got that completely wrong. But yeah, I know that you're also on the Design Tokens community group and spending a bunch of time there. But you're also a design technologist for TELUS Digital, which I know is a fantastic digital group. I've always heard great things about that gang. And you're in Toronto, is that true?
Yeah.
Awesome. I cannot wait to get back there. And then we have Taylor Cashdan, who is an absolute glutton for punishment. He was the first person to volunteer to be a part of this this little misadventure. I believe, normally you'd be joining from Raleigh, North Carolina as a design systems lead for Hologram, but I heard a little rumor that you might actually not be at home. I think you may be joining us from somewhere else. Where are you sitting right now?
Correct. I'm in New York City for Schema, for Figma's design systems.
Nice. I was just there for Smashing Conference 2 weeks ago.
Awesome.
And then finally, we've got Eric Bailey joining us from Somerville, Mass., mainly because I know that you will cause a lot of trouble. Pot stir is one of the things that I had written down in your bio. Again, also somebody I know who's a pretty big advocate of design systems, and I know you're concerned with those at GitHub, where you spend your days these days, when you are also likewise not writing, speaking, or generally agitating the masses in other contexts. Eric, you actually in Somerville right now, or are you off somewhere else?
No, that's correct. I'm Boston area resident number 2 in this chat.
Awesome. Well, I am joining from just down the road in Providence, so we're actually pretty well concentrated in the Northeast. I think Donna, you get the most pixels traveled, I think, on the way here. So let's get started. The reason I pitched this and wanted to loop all of you into this is to ask the question about whether or not we actually should be doing what we're doing. Design systems are great, and I know that we have to have something, but boy, they get complicated. Have we jumped the shark? Have we kind of become our own parody? I'm curious to know what some of your thoughts are on have we gone too far with the complexity of design systems, or have we not gone far enough yet?
It feels like the first thing. It feels like the first thing we need to define is, when we say design systems, what are we talking about? Because I think many folks interpret that differently. Every organization treats it differently. So it's hard to have a staggering stance one way or the other until we really know what we're defining, for sake of this conversation, as a design system.
Okay, and if you can actually do that in 15 seconds or less, I will give you a cookie.
Oh, I'm about to earn that cookie. So I tend to describe them as a stool, a 3-legged stool, and that so long you have a design asset, a shared code library, and documentation, you've got the 3 spokes of the stool, and then the support model and planning and roadmap and all that stuff is those side beams that hold the stool up. If you've got those 3 parts, you could put any product on top of that stool and it would be supported by the system itself. So in my head, that's the baseline minimum of like, if you're going to say you have a system, you have to have these working parts that are integrated, that are somewhat synced, whether it's through communication or a core team or whatever, to support and maintain them. Otherwise, it's just a set of disparate assets, which for many orgs is the right move. But in the sake of this conversation, I vote that's how we define it.
Excellent, but outside of 15 seconds, so my cookies are safe. So, Donna, that was an amazingly outsized reaction to that. So I'm going to actually pick on you next, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on, given Taylor's definition, where are things for you at TELUS? Do you feel like you still have a ways to go to get to the point where you should be? Or do you think that we've just gotten too complicated?
I don't like I'm speaking for my organization and my experience with it. So I feel like I like that metaphor of a stool, but I feel like in our organization, which is really big, is that our stool was meant to support certain products, and now we're trying to like put in the rest of the organization on this stool, and everyone's just kind of like trying to get on it. And so that's kind of the challenge for us, is like, how much do we scale the stool, or do we scale kind of our products to align and balance on it?
So I think, I can't even imagine with a company like TELUS, the complexity of doing something like that. I'm curious with more of I don't want to say a single, it's not just a single product, but GitHub is a little bit more focused in terms of what GitHub does as it runs GitHub. So Eric, what's the level of complexity and tooling that seems right to you for how GitHub uses a design system?
Sure. For me, you want to weigh complexity versus kind of ease of adoption. So like all the automation in the world, all the like fancy tricks, all the analytics don't mean anything if like being able to use a design system is like an impenetrable, impossible task. The other thing is, like, just to kind of stretch this stool metaphor as far as it can go, you get a guy who can make a stool, and then you have a stool and it's done, and design systems are never done. So like this stool is, every minute a carpenter's coming in to futz with the stool a little bit, and you're all trying to sit on it at the same time.
I'm actually curious how far we can torture this metaphor. I have a feeling we can. I feel like we have a ways to go before we completely run this into the ground. So I'm going to give Kathleen a shot here and see how badly you can torture this before we're just left with a pile of kindling.
Oh, we are just getting started with the stool, because you know what? I'm really liking this stool metaphor. So thank you, Taylor. I love this. So at Northwestern Mutual, which for brevity here, because it's a really long word, we're going to call it an NM, because it's just, words are hard for me. So at NM, we have a great stool so we do have design assets, we have component libraries, we have really robust documentation and a support model. So it's great. We are in the middle of scaling that stool. And this, in combination with what Eric was saying of like, you're trying to scale the stool, but everyone's always trying to use the stool, and like, how do you blend scaling the stool with everyone's trying to use the stool, and how do you mature the stool, and how do you, like, for example, integrate design tokens in there while everyone's using like one like sort of CSS model, and when you want to offer different types of CSS model, offerings in there, like how do you do this while like how do you build the plane while you're still flying it? Well, wait, that's a different metaphor. But anyway, so we're not fully into kindling right now. But as you can see, it gets complex. However, yes, you do have to have those foundations. We definitely have not jumped the shark. You have to do this thing carefully. You have to think of your teams. You have to think of those breaking changes. You have to plan carefully for those breaking changes and for those teams that are using your product and using your previous iterations, and for if are they using React, are they not using React, are they using different parts of your product, and making sure you're supporting different versions as you're planning for new releases as well.
That's fair. I guess I want to push back a little bit and so couldn't we just make this simpler? I mean, Donna, you're talking about making a design system work for more than one product. Is there a good reason to do that? I mean, why not just have multiple systems?
Right. So multiple products, but also multiple brands that do multiple applications. So I think for us, it's this idea of like one stool to have everyone sit on. And the point is, instead of giving everybody here a different brand, you get another stool, and a different brand, another stool, is that there is a support team that can maintain that complexity rather than push it towards that product or that brand. Hey, our stool works for us. Here's a stool that can work for you. So now who's going to maintain it? Like, who's got the budget to support a team to, do the things that we do or have the experience that we do? So in terms of a design system that's scaling to handle multiple products and multiple brands, that's kind of the thing that, like, hey, why don't we invest a little bit more, make it more mature so that it can account for these other products and brands?
So what's the point? When we do that, what do we get out of making a product card that can work with 4 different sets of typography and color? Like, is there a real benefit to having that one card? And I'm gonna sort of steer this one towards Eric a little bit, because I guess that's it. That's the question that we have to ask, that we have to be able to explain to our managers and the rest of our team what value we get out of that card or whatever it is being flexible enough to take on all these different brands. So what gives? Why do we do this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And like, when a design system's working, like it's largely invisible in my opinion. So like, one of the little notes I have for why you might not need a design system is if your organization is not focused on technical debt, is focused on like instant gratification, they're not going to want to know, or they're not going to care that you've created all this underlying abstraction that you can consistently reproduce a card. The debate on what a card actually is a whole other thing. But, on the flip side of that, like, if you want to make an accessible card, you really want to codify that in a design system. And if your design system is flexible enough to support multiple brands, that's amazing, because the last thing you want to do is reinvent the wheel 4 times and then have 4 different potentially inaccessible implementations of it.
I was really hoping that that's where you would go. Thank you. I won't keep it a secret. I'm certainly a fan of design systems and working in this way. But I think looking back over the history of ones that I've been involved in, I was thinking about this. This woman was giving a really Christine. I'm totally drawing a blank on her last name. Gave this fantastic talk on advanced Figma stuff at Smashing a couple weeks ago, and we were chatting a bit. And I think what struck me from her talk was that. What I paraphrase this to is, if you have a conversation with somebody about what you're building, you need to have a system of some kind. So the moment that it's not just you creating this, then if you have to talk to somebody else, there is a system, whether it's a good or a bad one, there is one. I guess that's really one of the things that I think is worth exploring, is just how much system do we need in our design? And maybe some thoughts from Taylor. I think I probably have had the least contact with you of everybody that's on here, or at least familiarity with hologram. How do design systems come into play, and how involved are they in your day-to-day projects?
Yeah, well, I think there's a few levels to that. Like, kind of harkening back to some of the things other folks have said, where I think you can have, once you get to the level of organizational maturity, to have a system of systems, right? I think that it doesn't need to be a single thing. I think that's often a choke point folks get stuck on. And the problem with the stool metaphor often is that we forget that, at least in the context of this work, like the stool is actually alive, right? It can grow, it can shrink, it could add legs. It's not an inanimate thing that once it's fixed, it's finished. So taking it from that theme, right, and thinking of it as design systems in the big sense as an internal tool, an internal product, if you will. I think there's validity to at least having the discussion at any level of an organization's maturity scale. And hologram, where I'm at currently, is one of those where we are in the process of preparing to eventually get back to scaling. It's a startup, so it's a very small environment, very small set of consuming teams, but they understand the levels of value that a system and some sort of alignment, whether it's in code cohesion or visual design aesthetic or whatever, can have on the overall impact and trajectory of a small organization, especially as they're moving fast and trying to spin up new features and ever accruing tech debt, as I think Eric, you had mentioned. There's benefits to that, and accessibility being one of them, right? Of things we can provide innately as part of the system, however you define it, that will help get things closer across the line. And one of those biggest benefits is that time and cost savings, right, on an individual contributor level. If you can spend the time and arguably the large upfront cost of building a system, this living thing, right, this slow rolling thing that'll eventually continue to evolve and enhance over time, all it does is increase that cost savings on a per individual basis, right? Where if you have that single shareable tile or that set of shared tokens or CSS values or whatever you're using to codify your style, it saves that millisecond, that moment, that hour of thinking that a consumer would have to do to go, well, which thing do I use? Which color goes here? Which object goes here? How do I need to build this thing for my product? And they could spend time enhancing the work that they're on, the project they're working on, as opposed to thinking of that abstract level beyond. So I think it's a long-term play, especially for small organizations like the one I'm at now, but the long-term benefit is limitless depending on how you scale it.
That's fair. I guess one of the things that I wonder about is the complexity goes somewhere. So I mean, I think as systems mature, I joke sometimes about them being more developer convenience systems than design systems, and so I think that a lot of effort goes into reducing complexity on the development side, but I've seen the more and more that we've tried to do at Chewy to make that design system more flexible. It is hard to avoid passing some of that complexity on to the initial users of that system, the designers. And I'm curious, especially with those of you working in the design token community, where you're trying to build ties between those two things, how do you balance not overloading the creation process in order to get that convenience and stability and scale on the engineering side? What does that look like, Kathleen, for your team and for the things that you've been looking at? Uh-oh, no audio.
Pardon me, I muted myself. So the question was, how do you not overload the creation process with tokens?
Yeah, for designers, like when you're trying to create, whether it's in Figma or whatever else, a system that can support multiple brands, multiple themes, whatever that it is that you're trying to do with the tokens, and avoid that complexity just getting overwhelming for the designers trying to learn how to use it in the first place.
Are you talking about like keeping the set of base tokens small and lean, or the semantic tokens small and lean?
Well, I guess
you
just
talking about
the
something
designer
different?
experience, I guess. You know, how trying to add that level of flexibility adds a little bit more load on the designer to figure out how to use these things well and still be able to come up with interesting designs and not slow down their process to pick the right style, make sure I have the right library loaded, and so on and so forth to manage all of that. What's the designer experience like for your team?
The designer experience for our team currently is we have a set of, well, right now we're building our global color tokens, like in process. I'm working on that right now. But what we do have in place at the moment is we have a set of base global color tokens and a small set of semantic color tokens for our typography. We're keeping it small and lean because we don't want to overwhelm our designers with a level of complexity that just doesn't take it to just doesn't overdo something that is not necessary right now. Because if you make it too complex, you're gonna just blow up a system that doesn't need to get too big too soon. So if you keep it small, where you have your most concise color ramps, like your neutrals and your base, brand palettes that are just, your raw values first, and then you have, your small set of semantic colors, maybe for your text and your links and your focus styles, and you start from there. And then maybe for your typography, set, and then just stop. And then when it's time to scale from there, then you just slowly add some smaller sets, and don't start just throwing things in because you think everyone will need it, because then it will just get way too big too fast. And it's like, why do we have all these just extra tokens that we may not need? It's like, just less is more. That's my opinion. I'd love to hear what everyone else thinks, because everyone's system has different needs. Because it's everyone, like smaller systems have different needs, bigger systems have different needs. This is what our system needs. And it makes sense to solve for what your company needs.
So, Donna, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, you were the one that had kind of originally brought up the idea of a stool that might change heights and colors and, I don't know, number of rungs or something. I don't know. What is that like at TELUS? How are you handling different brands, same components, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so when Taylor said that the stool is a living stool, that's kind of how I feel as well, because we really started very specific, certain amount of components, and it looks a certain way and functions a certain way to meet that product team's need. But how do you get now to say, like, this card is not just your card, it has to work for everybody? And if we're talking about multiple brands, say, hey, this card, you need to define the border, the background, all these things, and you ask them to do that. But it's not just the brand vision itself. It's how do you get those product designers who are, defining their need, but then also having brands say, like, again, the design system itself is not defining the brand vision or, this is the design principle. We also consume our company's design principles, brand vision, accessibility. So it's almost kind of like, how do we get these people sit at the table, and get the product people sit at the table and get them to talk about, like, what do I need? Do you need this color? Like, hey, that's not on brand. You probably could try another color. And then for us to be like, and now that's on the system. So I feel like it's not just giving the product and the component and the code and the design to our consumers. It's about having everybody communicate together and like facilitate that communication, whether that's on Slack, whether that's office hours, whether that's like meeting in person. I feel like that's some of the work that I do. And it's like, oh no, Donna, you are empowered to make these decisions. And I'm like, I don't speak for this brand. I don't know what this product needs. And so it's kind of like, okay, everybody, let's get together and then land on something that we can now say it is reusable. It could be flexible for these different users.
I think what you're hitting on is something that I think is really often overlooked, in that a really successful design system, as the way I'm hearing it from you, is one that is a synthesis of a collective agreement about what the design is versus a one-way, here, we created this thing, now you go use it. Am I sort of hearing that in the right way for you? And I could spend another day asking you questions about how you manage that process, but is that a little bit more how things work with TELUS?
I really like how you kind of condensed that, so I agree. So we have a design system as a collective expression of an organization's opinions about design. Eric, when do we not need that? When is this just a giant waste of time and we should do things just way simpler?
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, I'm
looking for somebody to flip a table here. Come on.
Okay. Yeah. All right. To build off what Donna said, spicy opinion, spicily held. Design systems are inherently political, and they reflect the reality of your organization's politics. A design system could be dead, meaning that your organization does not value a design system and potentially design or quality of craft. It can be highly active and then potentially having the wrong kind of person putting the wrong kind of pressure to have overrepresentation of concerns. So say a marketing arm really spends a lot of time going in to make sure that they're felt, but it's this kind of misrepresents overall what the company wants to do and what it wants to achieve. Now you're spending a lot of specialist hours, catering to their needs as opposed to potentially holistically what the organization needs. Is that controversial enough for you?
Well, I think it is, but I think that's an interesting conundrum, because what the organization needs, what the end user needs, and is it reflective of the brand? I think are can be very different, but I'm not sure that you could say categorically that one of those things is inherently more important than all the others. I mean, perhaps end user, but still, if it doesn't represent who the company is, then is it really going to be useful? How do you manage that? I mean, because I think in a way, what you're describing is spending time understanding whether or not the system is actually reflective of the voice of the company. And I guess I'm a little on both sides of that, but I'm curious. That's a strong way to characterize it. Specialist hours on something that might not be, ultimately of value. I don't know. I'm trying to do my best to argue both sides of this, but that was really kind of striking to me.
Yeah, everybody wants to make a design system and nobody wants to do governance. And that is a thing I keep seeing all throughout my career.
Well, what's interesting on that too is I think there's a difference between a design system and designing systematically, right? I mean, there's the formal thing that we're talking about here, the product, right? And then there's also hey, some orgs don't need a true product. They need just to think a little more about the places those changes they're trying to make are impacting. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they need dedicated specialists. It just means maybe an engineer and a designer needs to have another conversation before they make a change, right? That is the effectively the backbone of what spurred, at least in my learning and understanding of this space, where this came from was maybe we can't just make that sweeping change without breaking 1,000 things. So if you're talking about does a company of any size need a formalized program, in my opinion, it has to match number one, business need, right? What problem are you trying to solve by slapping together a system or putting together a group of specialists to do this? Is it really organizational issues and product leadership and direction? Your system approach may not be the thing to solve organizational issues, right? But if you're talking about operational efficiency or lack of single source of truth for either consumer group to pull from, sure, a system could solve for that, but there are many steps in between the messy environment to the full-on system environment that you can take to get there, or at least to get you closer. I think oftentimes, because it's such a hot topic these days, it becomes a buzzword of, oh, we need a design system because every other org has one, and then they just either settle for a Figma UI kit or some random code library they get a license to, and they're like, oh, great, now we have one. It's like, okay, hang on, you have a resource, that's awesome, but you don't have all the other parts that you need to make sure it stays relevant. And to everyone's points though so far is that people have a way to get things fixed and to ask questions and to make sure that that thing is stable for them, and a group to fix those instability, times when those things come up. So no, I would say it's not the right solution for every organization, especially if they don't have the business need or business case to warrant the cost, frankly.
Mm. That's really well put. Thank you. I think, so we've talked a bit about the size of the system, the formality of it. You touched on governance, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say that's probably the most important aspect of any given design system, whether it's a shared sketch file or something way more complex. I'm curious. We've got a sort of a kind of a range of different kinds and scales of organizations here. I'd love to hear more about what governance means to all of you. I want to start with you, Kathleen. What does that process look like? How do you keep the system sane?
Well, I wouldn't use the term sane. I would use more manageable, just because, I'm going to keep away from ableism here. But so I would say to keep the system manageable, you have to, there's a careful dance because the system is a product. And you have your contributors and you want to keep your contributors happy, but your system is a product, and you see me going, ah! So you want to encourage contributions in your system, but you also don't want to have everything just shoved into your system. So you have to tread carefully when you field requests for suggestions of what should come into your system. So you have to answer questions in a diplomatic way and explain, like if something belongs in the system, be open to new suggestions, because it could be something that could be a great idea of something that belongs in the system that you haven't thought of, but also something that is a suggestion that either is not in the roadmap or couldn't make it into the system for reasons. You should be able to back up why that shouldn't be in the system and explain why in a way that will not alienate your users, but also encourage them to want to come back and ask more questions or, contribute something else.
Okay, I've got so many follow-up questions to this, but I want to actually give other folks a chance to respond. Just how do I apologize. Sane was not a good word to use. Manageable, I think, is a good one. What is that, Eric? What does that look like at GitHub? What's the process that for governance of the system itself?
Yeah, so we have, and the fortunate thing is the primer team has it's more than just 2 people, which is amazing, and we have representation for engineering, for design, for accessibility, and I think that's honestly a little bit rare compared to a lot of other organizations. So governance for us is oftentimes making sure there's uniformity across different kind of product features. The whole big caveat is I'm still pretty new, so my answer is dependent on what I've observed and participated in. But I guess kind of also building off what Kathleen said, like, you want your governance to be as ego-free as possible. Like another thing that will ruin a design system when you don't want a design system is when there is like an agenda and it's one person kind of steering the ship with a pointed destination in mind that isn't necessarily in alignment. And a lot of the times that can happen with like a single individual who's just more willing to put in the time. And it's not necessarily even a bad thing. It's just like the more time you spend with something, the more your sense of ownership grows with it. And so like making sure you check yourself there.
I think the flip side to something like that is very often I've seen design systems start with that individual effort. And it's interesting to find a point of maturity where that can change. And I'm not sure it always happens successfully, that transition away from it being one person's vision to that more collective expression. How is that process managed at TELUS, Donna? Like when does something new come in?
Okay, so we've been doing community contribution for a while. So through our evolution, we had the single brand design system, and now we have the multi-brand design system. And through that, we had a lot of experience, a lot of feedback. Like the process is too slow, the contribution has too many like blockers, too many checkpoints, and we don't know what things are. And so from what we've learned from that is really, like Kathleen said, is like to be transparent. So we have a document of the process. Here are all the steps you need to meet. But then also we have this, again, the office hours, like the meeting ad hoc, and be like, hey, you've gone through this process. Have you completed it? Have you reached out to accessibility review? Have you looked at, we kind of get back, like, we know you're doing this process. Here are the things. So there's one where you could self-serve the contribution, and there's a part where we can help support you. And so this kind of creates a lot of requests. So like, oh, I can contribute, like ticket, get started, request this, request that. So how do we manage that is, again, kind of be honest on the tickets and be like, hey, this is great, this is missing, please come back. And then also just being very clear about showing our project status so that people know what we're prioritizing. There are things that we take in the spring, like, okay, we expect this, but there's other campaigns that are coming in and they're high priority. So we're going to have to pivot a little bit. So it's continuing communication with our consumers to, like, again, they can contribute and they have to go through this process. And we're trying to apply that as well for the different brands and be like, hey, you want to contribute something, this is a similar process that we do within our brand. And it can work for multi-brand as well, where it's like, hey, we have this need for a component. It's not available in this, the majority of our users, but like that works for you. So it's kind of different levels of contribution. Again, we can only do so much. We have a small team. And so what happens when they do get blocked, when we can't help them through that? There's always an escape hatch, right? Like teams constantly do their own thing. The benefit that we tell them is, with the benefit of you contributing to the system, is your product is not the only one that has that special card. Now, another product can potentially use that and can make each other, better, like you can improve it, that kind of stuff. So those are the benefits we try to tell people by contributing. The other thing as well is, if people have all these, siloed product in their own, code base, no one has access to that. You can't audit that. And so and I imagine this is something that I work with my team, like, it's okay if people contribute all these weird, not good, not on brand things. At least it's there. And then we can tell them, why did you create that when you could have had this? Like, we can't score quality yet unless we're able to audit that and measure it kind of thing. And then be able to tell our leadership, like, listen, we've done our best, but here are the things that are still kind of like not on brand, not accessible kind of stuff. So we can only do so much. We're not a hammer to tell people no. That's how I feel.
That's great. So I'm curious, actually, if anybody has a process in their organization to handle those contributions as as a contributed component or pattern, whatever you want to call it, that other folks can use, even if it's not something that you maintain. So like a contributed space in a way, like modules or plugins for WordPress or Drupal or whatever.
We had something similar. So before Hologram, I was at Fidelity Investments, and we had, because that organization's so enormous, you have tiger teams, for lack of a better description, that are charged with like fixing a particular area of an experience, right? And they want to take a systematic approach because they're likely impacting multiple, whether it be features inside that experience or even multiple sub products within it. So I think there's a lot of value of creating those exploration spaces that are sometimes devoid of what maybe the mainstream system is providing to kind of challenge and vet those ideas. I think the hard part is, especially, and Eric, you mentioned politics, and I couldn't agree more when you said that. This is where it gets really sticky, right? Because this is arguably the linchpin we're kind of dancing around, whether you're talking about governance or exploration or whatever, is depending on how the organization sees these special teams that handle these things. You could either be creative directors and technical leads, or you can just be operationalizing certain aspects of an already existing feature set. So having, for example, those exploration teams, right, or those spaces, the sandbox environments where folks can play and manipulate and break things, is great. I think what you have to set the tone of very quickly is, number one, that space is experimental, right? So everything used there has a chance of blowing up when it gets in production, right? It may be stable, it may not, right? That's number one. Number two, that they may be using or alluding to some things that come from, if you have a formalized system, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're endorsed by the formalized system. And that's where like that opinion kind of comes in on governance of, a system team should never be in this, ivory tower just prescribing from above. But there are some aspects where if there is not good top-down leadership support, where a system has to make a call, right, whether it's a difficult decision or not, like they have to be empowered to do so. So there's a line you dance there as a practitioner of, do I make this choice for my consumers? Do I make it with them, or do I let them make it, right? And that list of criteria happens with everything, whether you're talking about adding a token, whether you're talking about doing a patch fix on a component, whether you're talking about creating a net new object, whether you're talking about theming, it doesn't matter. That decision tree is constantly in our heads, right, of like, is this something we can just do? Should we do this? Is this something that we need to go and check with 10 teams, 10 products? Should we let them do that? And accessibility is a great segue into that, right? There's only so much we can bake into the system, right? There are things that consumers will have to configure, like filling in ARIA labels, right? Or double checking that just because they use the accessible color palette, if they combine it in a way that no longer allows for that contrast, well, guess what? It's no longer accessible, right? So there's levels to these things. And I think that's often the part that's missed, especially when we were earlier talking about how much should folks be expected to understand, right? I think we as practitioners have to gauge our consumer group, our leadership, our audience of, do they need a slow drip or can they handle the fire hose, right? Because if you give them too much at once, they just gloss over, right? But if you don't give them enough, then they're like, well, I'm gonna go do my own thing because it was working before we had you guys. So why do I need to listen? Right. And there's a balance between that education and that doing. And so I think often folks are like, systems work is just people coding and designing in a corner and writing doc. And they think like that's 80% of the job, right? And the other 20 is filled with meetings. When realistically, it's like 65 to 70% is just discussions with your consumers, discussions with the rest of your team members, just chalking through concepts, right? And maybe 10% of that is the actual time when you're dedicated in that code environment or that design tool making the thing. But it's all that discussion, all that decision, all that recording, all that checking up front that allows the long tail of your program to actually stick around and not just be a decision that was made once and is rewritten, or a thing that doesn't work for n number of consumers or products or brands or whatever your org is set up as.
I know that we're actually getting down to the last 10 minutes or so of our Q&A. We've talked around this a little bit, and this kind of follows on what you're talking about, Taylor, a bit. There's a question from Kevin about experiences of product owners requesting changes to a design system. I think the threshold, is sort of the important thing as part of this discussion that kind of harkens back to the governance bit. What is that threshold to determine whether something is accepted or rejected as a change to that system or a component? What does that process look like at GitHub, Eric?
Yeah, so there is broken, and then there is broken, and then there is works just fine, but is viewed to be broken. Or and I think there's a delicate kind of line you got to walk between, do you fix something that is lowercase b broken and potentially break it for other unknown people? There is capital B broken, which is one of the cool things about a design system is you can fix it and, computer heal thyself. And then there is kind of like, is this the kind of person you can say no to? And then how much of that lives in your system, and how much of that is like negatively impacting, the unseen majority's experience of working with that system. Like, stop me if you've heard this one. A design system maintainer crashes a meeting and says, here's a whole new workflow to put inside of a process you've never heard of with a product you've never heard of, and hypothetically in 5 years it'll be great. And then 2 weeks later, oh no, we're completely changing all that all over again. That's the experience you want to avoid, because that's where breakage, I think, occurs, and that's where a lot of this kind of stuff bubbles up.
That's I have to tell you that computer heal thyself is playing very well with the crowd. That is for sure. Dear listeners, I will confess, I put this panel together because we're going through so many of these challenges on our team, and I'm so curious to hear how other folks are managing it. So thank you for indulging me. I'm going to get back to asking them more questions about things that I want to know, and hopefully they'll be interesting to you too. So I think Corbin had a really it was a lengthy, wonderfly worded question that I'm going to butcher in trying to paraphrase and summarize a little bit, but. Tokens, subcomponent offerings, things like that, that's sort of a desire for that flexibility in the design system, balancing, paving those cow paths that we're trying, that sort of collective expression of our view on design, versus wanting it to be more powerful. Again, balancing for the novice designer who's coming in, who's somebody's new and is just getting onboarded, versus the people who are trying to think through applying this system across very different typographies, different color systems, that kind of thing. Again, I just want to come back to that balance for the designer and how you all navigate that, either for engineering or design, or for product owners even. Just managing that level of that duality of keeping it easy to use while still enhancing that flexibility. Anybody have some thoughts they want to share on walking that line? Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to harken back a little bit to the drip versus hose kind of thing. Here's my hot take. PMs and designers don't need to understand design tokens deeply, at least not initially, right? I think there's abstraction levels that you can begin to educate folks on, because you have to remember, like, or what I tend to remind myself is, like, we may be in this bubble working on this thing, right? And we're hoping to continue to bring people into the bubble or step out of the bubble to make sure what we're building is informed by the people we're building it for. But at the end of the day, it's helpful sometimes to put on the other hat, right? Remember, like, what it was like or what it might be like to be a designer, an engineer, a PM on a team. Do they care about your token taxonomy and the different variations of the tile you offer? No, they just need to build a thing within a certain timeline to deliver a feature by the end of a sprint, right? And when we remind ourselves of that, I think it helps us understand, okay, how much level of information do they really need at this moment in time to know how to use the thing they need to use correctly? And what are things that we can spend, a lunch and learn session digging them into, a month from now, or in a retro at the end of the sprint going, well, we missed the ball a little bit. If we did better to explain the functionality of this thing, you may have not run into the problems that you ran into last time. Let's set up that time to do that, right? Or having a recurring office hours where you can spend time, educating folks and having that session recorded so folks can look at it later. I think oftentimes we get stuck in a pattern of, like, well, our consumers don't understand. And it's like, well, did we really give them the opportunity to learn yet? Did we teach them? Or are we kind of stuck in our little dome, remembering we had so much to get done that we forgot to then reach out and extend like, hey, by the way, here's this thing. Let's break it down real quick before we ship this massive update or this large project or whatever. And you may not understand it because it's not in your job requirement. Right. So I think it's a cycle of education and learning that we have to maintain at all times to make sure that if we're shipping something brand new or creating something complex, we have to gauge at this moment in time, do our consumers need to understand it deeply at the surface level or somewhere in between, and then set up some sort of mechanism to satisfy that level of learning before or during shipping that thing so that they can understand along the way why we're doing something, so that they don't get to that point where it's like system team or system group or whatever is doing this complex thing. I don't have time to learn it, therefore I can't use it. And then all of a sudden you've got folks that are not adopters, and there's a problem, innately in that situation.
Kathleen, you want to jump in?
I do, but I also want to do a little bit of rebuttal. So I do agree with Taylor. I do agree with you on the design level and on the product owners level on the simplicity of it. But I also want to caution on, I do think there should be a little bit of guidance for developers on token usage, especially if you offer a set of base level tokens and you have semantic levels. If you hand someone a set of base level tokens and don't coach someone that if the semantic tokens are available or the component level tokens are available, use the proper tokens for the proper usage. Someone might be just either using a raw value or the wrong token for the wrong thing, and then you're gonna have a mess on your hands. So there has to be a balance. So I do agree, like, document as you go, don't document later, do document for the use case, for your audience, but also make sure that you are adding the documentation for the right audience. But also, to your point, Taylor, do not lose your audience in the weeds as well.
Yeah, you call out a great thing. It could be different levels of education per group, right? You're serving a multitude of different disciplines, and each discipline may need something different. And I didn't explicitly call it engineers because you're totally right. They need that's their world, right? They need to know.
I think just from our experience that I think that's actually the most important piece of it is anything can be compatible with the design system if they apply the tokens well. I mean, or at least it gets you much further down that path. So I would tend to agree that the education side on the engineering is probably some of the most intensive, but it will pay the biggest dividends. Kathleen, was there more that you wanted to add? I know you kind of got sidetracked by starting an argument, so I just want to give you that chance before we run out of time.
No, I think I think I'm good. Yeah. I saw a really good hot take, but it was completely off topic from this. So earlier this morning about design systems. So yeah.
Well, there was one other question that I think is really super relevant, and I want to pose this one, and we're just about out of time. I'm going to pick on you, Donna. For companies that have bandwidth to invest in building, may not have bandwidth to invest in a dedicated team, how do they start and convince the higher-ups that it's worth the investment?
Yeah, so again, from the very beginning of the history of our design system at TELUS, it did start with an engineer, Laura Cabrera, actually, and she's still part of the organization. Again, she's just part of a product team now, is that it started with just her collecting, the coded components. And then again, from her perspective, this makes it easier for her to, code her applications. And really that investment of like, hey, it's not just your team that can benefit from this, it's like other teams. And so that's how the design system in TELUS grew. And now we're getting into the multi-brand. And we've got, I would say, let's say 80% of our consumers is the TELUS brand, but we've got other brands that could leverage the system, but they are not as big as our consumers. And so they don't have their teams that could potentially work on the design system is the same team that is maintaining and producing their application. So again, they don't have time to do all this management, customization, building of tokens, and that kind of stuff. So we can give them that benefit and be like, hey, you could use the system. You don't have to rebuild all the modals and buttons, all that stuff. It's still an investment on their brand to either build their own or adopt ours. And so what you're seeing now is like, hey, it's really fast for us to like build our own colors and all that stuff, and they can continue that path. But again, they stay small and they stay like overloaded with that kind of work. And so what we're doing in order to say, hey, stop doing that, start using this, is let's make our system to the level or parallel of what they have, so that that transition is more tasty and more like delicious for them. And I feel like that is a lot of effort. It's a lot of investment because they're not quite 100% user yet. And it's about like, hey, maybe you can't consume the components yet because you're not on the same technology, but like here's tokens. That little bit of education is like, how can you use tokens? How can tokens be your gateway into our system? It's so much how you get other teams to invest in the design system. And again, I'm thinking more of that organization level, but not necessarily, hey, you're a new organization, how do you invest in a design system?
Well, I know I would be happy to keep going with this for quite a while, but I think we're heading out of time here. Donna, thank you. That was I think an awesome way to sum this up. So Andrew, for your question, I think start slowly, start small, pave a couple of cow paths, and with every one of those things, quantify your wins. I think that's something that we didn't talk about all that much is along the way, you've got to be able to start to articulate the value that is being generated for your organization in time saved, in fewer defects, in faster deployments, reduced design time, all of those things. Keep that stuff in mind. Chart your wins. Talk about them. Celebrate them. Make sure that your team knows. Kathleen, Donna, Taylor, Eric, I can't thank you enough for volunteering to jump into this madness with me. I love all the things we've been talking about. I love all your contributions. Thank you so much for being here today.